Disguised as a homeless man, billionaire Nathaniel Cross tests society's perceptions, only to be treated like a criminal. When confronted by law enforcement, assumptions turn into authority, and bias becomes undeniable. But when he reveals his true identity, the tables turn. A powerful social experiment exposing privilege, prejudice, and the question, why does respect only come with status? If you like this content, please click like and subscribe to the channel. Nathaniel Cross sat in the backseat of his Rolls-Royce, fingers tapping against a leather armrest. The tinted windows blurred the view of the world outside. His world, the one where doors opened before he could knock, where people listened before he had to raise his voice. But today he wasn't Nathaniel Cross, the billionaire, the philanthropist, the man whose name carried weight in boardrooms and gala events. Today he was no one. His driver, a sturdy man named Carter, who had been with him for years, glanced at him through the rear-view mirror. "You sure about this, sir?" Nathaniel adjusted the worn-out hoodie he had thrown over his head. It smelled like a thrift store, the fabric stiff and faded. "Yeah, I need to see it for myself." Carter hesitated. "If anything goes wrong, I'll call you," Nathaniel said, stuffing a cheap prepaid phone into his pocket. "Just give me 2 hours." Carter sighed but nodded. "I'll be close." Nathaniel stepped out of the car, the rush of cold air hitting him instantly. The shift was immediate. Without his tailored suits and polished shoes, without the silent announcement of wealth following his every step, he became invisible. He pulled the hood lower over his face and walked towards a park. The place was clean, orderly. Parents pushed expensive strollers along paved paths. Joggers passed by in their neon sportswear, and an elderly couple sat feeding the ducks near the water. Nathaniel made his way to a weathered bench near a row of trees and sat down. Then he waited. At first, nothing happened. A few people walked past, stealing quick glances before looking away. A man in a business suit approaching from the right side of the path slowed slightly, eyes narrowing, as he took Nathaniel's hunched posture and ragged clothes. For a moment it seemed like he might say something. Instead, he pulled out his phone and veered toward another path. A woman in yoga leggings and a designer jacket pushed her stroller past him, her grip tightening on the handle as she picked up her pace. Nathaniel exhaled, leaning back against the bench. He wasn't being harassed. No one was yelling at him, but the avoidance was loud. He was being categorized, dismissed, and no one even knew his name. Across the park, a patrol car crept forward, its tires rolling slowly over the pavement. Nathaniel's gaze flickered toward it. The moment of truth. The car idled for a few seconds before parking. From the driver's side, a man stepped out, tall, built like an ex-football player, with a neatly trimmed mustache and an expression that gave away nothing. Sergeant Daniel Brooks. He didn't approach right away. He just watched. Nathaniel kept his posture relaxed, his expression neutral, but he felt the weight of those eyes. Then, after what felt like an eternity, Brooks took his first step forward. But what came next was nothing Nathaniel could have predicted. Nathaniel kept his hands resting on his lap, his posture still, his expression unreadable. He had spent years in boardrooms, negotiating billion-dollar deals with men who measured power by the weight of their wallets. But here, on this bench, power wasn't about money. It was about perception. Sergeant Daniel Brooks walked toward him, his boots pressing into the gravel path with slow, deliberate steps. He didn't reach for his radio. He didn't say anything right away. He just observed, assessing, calculating. Nathaniel could feel it. "You been here long?" Brooks finally asked, his voice flat. Nathaniel turned his head slightly, meeting the officer's gaze. He let his voice carry a slight rasp, a tiredness he didn't actually feel. "Just sitting." Brooks's eyes flicked over him, his faded jeans, the worn hoodie, the scuffed-up sneakers he had bought at a thrift store that morning. The officer's expression didn't change, but his stance did. More rigid, more alert. "You from around here?" Nathaniel shrugged. "Just passing through." Brooks didn't like that answer. His fingers twitched near his belt, not on his weapon, but close enough that the message was clear. "This is a family park," the officer said, his tone tightening. "We've had complaints about people loitering." Nathaniel's mouth twitched at the choice of words. Loitering. Not sitting, not resting. Loitering. A word that turned stillness into suspicion. Did someone complain about me? Nathaniel asked, tilting his head. Brooks didn't answer. Instead, his radio crackled softly, and he reached for it, muttering something Nathaniel couldn't make out. A silent request for backup? Or just letting dispatch know he was occupied? Nathaniel could feel the air shifting around them. The same joggers who had passed by earlier were suddenly finding new routes. The elderly couple near the water was gone. Even the mother with the stroller had turned her back, pretending to be engrossed in her phone. No one was watching, yet everyone was aware. Brooks let out a breath through his nose, stepping closer. Look, I don't know what your situation is, but if you need a place to go, there's a shelter about 2 miles west. Nathaniel almost laughed. 2 miles west? He owned a high-rise building 3 blocks from here. But he didn't say that. Instead, he held Brooks's gaze and asked, "Am I breaking any laws?" Brooks didn't answer immediately. His jaw tightened just for a second. That was all Nathaniel needed to see. The hesitation, the irritation. "If you don't have business here, I'd suggest moving along." Brooks said, there it was. The expectation, the unspoken rule. People like him, or at least a version of him they assumed, weren't supposed to stay in places like this. Nathaniel leaned back on the bench, deliberately slow. "And if I don't—" Brooks shifted his weight. "Then we've got a problem." But Nathaniel was about to show him that the real problem wasn't him. It was the way the world decided who belonged and who didn't. The air between them felt like a stretched rubber band, taut and waiting to snap. Nathaniel had faced tough negotiators, ruthless investors, and media hounds looking for the slightest misstep. But this was different. Sergeant Brooks didn't see a man who had built an empire from the ground up. He saw a problem to remove. Brooks squared his shoulders. "Sir, I'm asking you one more time. Do you have a reason to be here?" Nathaniel let the silence settle. He could hear the distant hum of traffic, the chirping of birds in the trees. But beneath it there was something sharper, the awareness of people watching without watching. "It matter?" Nathaniel finally asked. His voice was calm, steady. Brooks's jaw twitched. "Because I enforce city ordinances. And if someone's loitering in a public space with no clear purpose, I have the right to ask questions." Nathaniel tilted his head slightly. "And if I were sitting here in a suit?" Brooks hesitated, just for a second, but Nathaniel caught it. "This has nothing to do with—" "It has everything to do with it," Nathaniel interrupted, his voice firmer now. "You saw me sitting here. I wasn't asking for money. I wasn't bothering anyone. I was just existing. But you walked over anyway. Why?" Brooks's eyes darkened. "Because I do my job, or because I look like someone who doesn't belong." That question hung between them, thick and suffocating. Brooks exhaled sharply through his nose. "I don't have time for games. Either you move along, or I'll have to escalate this." Nathaniel felt his pulse slow. There it was, the moment he'd been waiting for, the moment that turned discomfort into authority, turned curiosity into force. A couple walked by on the opposite side of the path, throwing nervous glances in their direction, not concerned enough to intervene, just enough to witness. Nathaniel shifted on the bench, resting his elbows on his knees. "So let me get this straight. A man sitting alone in a park, bothering no one, is now a police matter?" "Matter?" Brooks didn't blink. "I don't make the rules." "No, but you choose when to enforce them." Another flicker of hesitation. This time Brooks masked it quickly. He reached for his radio, pressing the button. "Dispatch, I've got an individual at the park refusing to cooperate. Gonna need additional units." Nathaniel almost smiled. Refusing to cooperate, a phrase designed to strip humanity, to turn a person into an incident. The situation had escalated exactly the way he had anticipated, but what he hadn't anticipated was how far it would go. Nathaniel kept his expression neutral, but inside his mind raced. The moment the call went through, the dynamic shifted. Before it had been one officer exercising authority. Now it was an incident, a potential threat. Sergeant Brooks's stance changed, more squared, more prepared. He wasn't just watching Nathaniel now. He was preparing for a response. A woman walking her dog paused a few feet away, pretending to adjust a leash. A jogger pulled out his phone, holding it low, but angling it just enough to record. The attention was growing, but no one stepped forward. Nathaniel exhaled. He had two choices. He could stand, comply, and let this encounter become just another quiet injustice. Or he could hold his ground and make them show their hand. He chose the latter. Not breaking any laws, he said, his voice steady. Brooks tilted his head slightly, studying him. You're refusing to leave after being told to move. That's not a law, Nathaniel replied. Brooks's patience thinned visibly. His grip on his radio tightened. I'm giving you a lawful order. You can comply, or we can take the next step. Officer? Brooks didn't answer right away. He just stared, the kind of stare meant to intimidate, to make a man doubt himself. But Nathaniel had spent decades in boardrooms where power was a language, and he understood the dialect fluently. Then sirens. A second patrol car pulled up. Another officer stepped out, Officer Lucas, shorter than Brooks, younger, but carrying the same air of authority. He approached, glancing at Nathaniel, then back at Brooks. What's going on? Lucas asked. Brooks kept his gaze on Nathaniel. Individuals refusing to vacate after being instructed, constructed. Lucas looked Nathaniel up and down, his expression already settled into suspicion. Is he trespassing? Brooks exhaled sharply. No. But nothing, Nathaniel interrupted. His voice cut through the space between them. I'm sitting in a public park. That's not illegal. Lucas pursed his lips. Then why are we here? Brooks didn't answer. For the first time since this encounter started, Nathaniel saw doubt creep into the officer's eye. The tension held, thick, waiting to snap. Then Brooks reached for his cuffs. Stand up, he ordered. A shift, a reaction from the crowd. People murmuring, a man on a nearby bench slowly standing as if debating whether to intervene. The jogger's phone lifted higher, now clearly recording. Nathaniel didn't move. On what grounds? Brooks clenched his jaw. Obstruction. A beat of silence. Then, you really want to do this? Nathaniel asked. But what happened next would change everything. For a moment, the only sound was a distant wail of traffic and the hushed murmurs of onlookers. Brooks stood firm, cuffs in hand, waiting for Nathaniel to comply. Lucas shifted on his feet, eyes darting between his partner and the growing audience. The tension was no longer just between them. It had become a spectacle. Nathaniel inhaled deeply, then slowly stood up. He wasn't afraid. He was waiting. Brooks moved in, ready to turn him around and restrain him. But before the officer could lay a hand on him, Nathaniel spoke, calm but commanding. I need you to think carefully about what you're doing, Sergeant, he said, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. Brooks barely blinked. I don't take orders from. You're about to put cuffs on a man for sitting on a bench, Nathaniel continued, ignoring the insult that almost slipped from the officer's lips. A man who hasn't broken a single law. A man who, just last week, donated $200,000 to the police department's community outreach program. Silence. A shift. Lucas frowned. What? Nathaniel reached into his hoodie pocket, not fast, not jerking, careful, and pulled out his phone. He unlocked it, tapped the screen a few times, then turned it around. The screen lit up with a news article. Billionaire philanthropist Nathaniel Cross donates $200K to local law enforcement initiatives. Brooks's entire expression cracked for the first time. Lucas leaned in, reading the headline, then looked at Nathaniel again. This time, his eyes held something other than suspicion. It was recognition. Nathaniel gave him a slow nod. Yeah, that's me. Brooks took a half step back, his mouth opening slightly, as if searching for the right words. Nothing came. The crowd had grown. More people were retarded King Do now. The story was already out of their hands. You assumed I was homeless, Nathaniel said, his voice level but edged with something sharper. You assumed I was a threat, and the moment I refused to bow to your authority, you escalated. Brooks's face burned red. Whether from embarrassment or anger, Nathaniel couldn't tell. Lucas cleared his throat. Mr. Cross. But Nathaniel lifted a hand. Don't, Mr. Comey, now that you know my name. Brooks looked lost, trapped. He had walked into a situation he thought he controlled, And now he was standing in the middle of a very public reckoning. For the first time, he had no script to follow. But Nathaniel wasn't finished yet. Brooks swallowed hard, his grip on the cuffs loosening. The shift in power was undeniable now. The man he had tried to remove from the park wasn't just another person society ignored. He was a man who could change the narrative with a single statement. Nathaniel didn't move. He let the silence settle in. The weight of the moment pressed down, not just on Brooks, but on everyone who had been watching, waiting to see how this would end. Lucas cleared his throat again, his tone suddenly softer, more measured. "Mr. Cross, I think there's been a misunderstanding." Nathaniel cut him off with a quiet laugh. "A misunderstanding?" "No," he said, shaking his head. "There was no misunderstanding. You understood me perfectly when you saw me sitting here. You saw what you wanted to see." Brooks exhaled sharply through his nose, his eyes darting toward the people filming. He wasn't just losing control, he was losing the narrative. Nathaniel took a step forward, forcing the officer to look him in the eye. "If I were wearing a suit, would you have questioned me?" Brooks said nothing. "If I were a white man sitting here in these same clothes, would you have called backup?" Brooks's jaw clenched, but still he had no answer. Nathaniel nodded. "Exactly." A murmur rippled through the bystanders. A few exchanged glances, some shifted uncomfortably. The truth was out in the open now, and no one could unsee it. Lucas tried again. "Look, we don't want any trouble. You're free to go." Nathaniel let out a slow breath, shaking his head. "That's the problem. I was always free to go, but you didn't want that. You wanted me gone." Brooks's face was unreadable now. A storm of emotions flickered across it. Anger, shame, maybe even regret. But it was too late for that. Nathaniel glanced around at the crowd. People were paying attention now in a way they hadn't before. He turned back to Brooks one last time. "You had a chance to do better. You didn't take it." Then, without another word, he stepped away. The crowd parted for him. People watching, whispering, still filming. Brooks and Lucas stood frozen, their authority stripped down to nothing but uniforms and regret. But this wasn't over. Nathaniel would make sure of that. Nathaniel walked away from the park, but the weight of what had just happened clung to him. The people watching, the silent judgments, the way authority had nearly crushed him for nothing more than existing in the wrong clothes. None of it surprised him. But that was the real problem, wasn't it? It should have been surprising. It should have been unacceptable. He pulled out his phone, scrolling past the unread messages from Carter. He knew his driver had seen the whole thing, probably itching to intervene. But this was bigger than him, bigger than a single encounter. His hands hovered over his screen before he started typing. A simple post, a short video, the truth. Within minutes, it was out in the world. No fluff, no dramatics, just fact. "I conducted a social experiment today. I sat on a bench in a public park. I didn't ask for anything. I didn't cause a scene. I just sat. And within minutes, I was confronted by law enforcement, treated like a criminal and threatened with arrest, because I didn't look like I belonged. The only thing that changed their approach? My name." He hit post. By the time he reached his penthouse, his phone was buzzing nonstop. Comments flooded in. Shock, outrage, agreement, denial. Some people demanded accountability. Others made excuses for the officers. But the truth was out now, and the conversation had begun. Carter met him at the door, arms crossed. "You all right?" Nathaniel exhaled. "I'm fine." Carter shook his head. They had no idea who they were messing with. Nathaniel gave him a small, tired smile. "That's the problem, Carter. It shouldn't have mattered who I was." Carter didn't argue. He just nodded, because he knew Nathaniel was right. The next morning his name was everywhere. News outlets picked up the story. Debates raged online. Some defended the officers. Others tore them apart. But the bigger question was louder than any excuse being made. Why does respect only come with wealth and status? The police department issued a statement, a weak, defensive one. But Nathaniel wasn't interested in apologies. He wanted change. He knew the video wouldn't fix everything. But if it made just one person stop and think before making assumptions, then it was worth it. Because next time, the person sitting on that bench might not be a billionaire and they might not walk away. If this story made you think, don't just sit with it. Share it. Start the conversation. Challenge the way we see people. Because change starts with awareness.